Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm Helen Eastman. I'm the Associate Artist of the Archive for Performance of Greek and Roman Drama at Oxford University. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the APGRD, on behalf of Oxford Playhouse, a theatre I've had the privilege of writing and directing at many times, and on behalf of the Cameron Mackintosh Fund at Oxford University. I'm absolutely delighted that today we are able to welcome a director of absolute international stature. One of the downsides of the current situation is that we're not able to all gather in Oxford on Mondays for our public lecture series. But one of the upsides is the ability to welcome an audience from all over the world. So thank you for being here, and to welcome speakers from all over the world. And today's speaker is beaming in from Singapore, where she has just arrived after spending 8 months, I think, trying to get out of Reykjavik and into Singapore. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions later in this session. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat on YouTube, though you need to be logged in to do that. And if you are not able to do that, you can email them to the APGRD, and Claire, the brilliant Claire from the APGRD, is posting the email address into the chat now, and you can send the questions, and then Claire will be relaying all questions from either email or from the YouTube chat over to me so I can ask them. So do feel free to chip in. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today's speaker, and in preparing my introduction I had to keep cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down because it ran to several million pages. That is the joy of introducing someone who has won quite so many awards and has been so prolific throughout their career. Yaël Farber is a multiple award-winning director and playwright of international acclaim, and her work has been seen all over the world: America, the UK, Africa, Canada, Australia, Japan, Europe, India, UAE, Singapore, and Hong Kong. She's been an invitee at the Lincoln Center Theatre Directors Lab in NYC, a guest artist at Mabu Mines Theatre Company in New York, Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin, the Public Theatre in NYC, and the Sundance Institute Theatre Lab in Utah. She was head of the directing program at the National Theatre School of Canada between 2009 and 2012. Recently, her acclaimed production of Hamlet transferred to St Anne's Warehouse in Brooklyn from the Gate Theatre in Dublin. She's directed Lorca's Blood Wedding for the Young Vic, Athol Fugard's Boseman and Lena at the Signature Theatre in NYC, David Harrower's Knives and Hens at the Donmar Warehouse, Lorraine Hansberry's unfinished final play Les Blancs for the National Theatre in London. It's an absolutely extraordinary production. Her production of Salome, which she wrote and directed initially for Washington's Shakespeare Theatre Company, was nominated for 10 Helen Hayes Awards and won 7, including Best Director and Best Play. That transferred to the National Theatre in London. Her production of Arthur Miller's The Crucible was an absolutely stunning success at the Old Vic in London, garnering 10 5-star reviews in the UK press. Nirvaya and Miss Julie have both won strings of awards and toured globally, and I know many of you will have seen them in different theatres all over the world. Her radical interpretations of Greek drama, Molora and Kadmos, have wowed audiences across the globe. So it's an absolute privilege to be able to interview her today. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us at such an awkward and weird time in Singapore and having just landed. Your work in general has divided into perhaps 2 categories: adaptations of classics and work that deals with testimonial and witnessing with actors. So I'm going to start with some questions really about the radical adaptations of classical texts before we bring those things together. And cited as we are conceptually at the moment at the APGRD, I'm going to start with the work drawing on Greek tragedy, Molora and Kadmos. And I guess I have to open with the big question, which is, as a theatre maker, what draws you to these ancient texts as a way of talking about the now and talking about contemporary politics?
First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to join. The ancient texts, they just offer a breadth of experience. It allows for a very a deep kind of interpretive element, which is something that I really embrace, because first of all, I think that the ancient Greeks, they have this, I've said before, but they have this extraordinary way of showing us how far we haven't come in several thousand years, that we are exactly like our forefathers and mothers were, with the same preoccupations. They also, they look back to a time when theatre had a very specific function, which I think is still the calling of theatre. But I think it's, as Peter Brook says, over the over the centuries, the Orphic wines have been sullied drop by drop until we have the gala evening. So, you know, the actual medicinal purpose, or the you know, the social thrust of what it means to attend theatre is what excites me, and the ritual element. And these texts offer great possibilities for that, for the sensuality. You know, any play that was meant to be performed beneath the stars and in those massive amphitheaters, they were in attendance of, it was a summonsing to something larger than how small we can become in ourselves. I think that there's a way that these plays reflect the national within the domestic, that is just genius. You know, that you can watch a family, a cursed house fall apart, and understand a nation and how a nation falls apart or rebuilds itself or examines itself. How we deal with things like justice and vengeance and all the big stuff. But within that is, you know, can be a couple struggling to overcome bitterness of the past. Or so there's just the way that the lens, the aperture expands and contracts is very exciting to me, and brings us into the larger sweep of what it is to be human and what it means to attend the theatre.
It's an incredible answer, and fascinating in terms of thinking about how these plays give us those psychological small family stories in the context of broad politics. And when I think when I first saw Molora with your extraordinary chorus, who were throat singers, traditional throat singers, I think for the first time I understood a lot of aspects of chorus in ritual theatre. The chorus as witness, as choir, as community. Could you tell us a bit about the experience of working in that way?
I mean, you know, I hope one day to write a great deal about what I experienced, particularly with the local cultural group. But I think that this technology of the chorus is something that we will never really know what it was in those ancient amphitheaters. We will never be able to hear what it sounded like or see the choreography. But again, I'm going to quote Brooke, that we remember it in our bones. And so, you know, and I think I've seen a lot of theatre that tries to, we all try to inculcate or somehow manifest whatever that very potent technology was, that ancient technology. And mostly we all fail at it. It's very, very hard if you can't unlock that device at the core of it. You can turn a Greek tragedy, you know, into a thriller, but it has a larger scope than that, and it rests in the secret of the chorus. So anyway, I'd heard the sound of the local cultural group on a CD. There were CDs in those days. And because I was creating sound for another show, and I just said to someone, "What is that? Who is that?" I was listening to Indigenous South African music, and someone told me it was the cultural group, and I just felt like I was listening to the sound of truth, some kind of vibration that put me in touch, that went beyond language. So we know if there were utterances from the chorus that transcended merely spoken language or just standing there, then there was something more somatic that was happening for the audience and for the performers that spoke beyond language. Anyway, I went out to this rural village where they're based in the Transkei. It was quite an interesting and treacherous journey to get there, with all the potholes and the I'm sorry, I have no idea how to turn off the notification sound that pings through, and if I do, you won't be able to hear me, so you'll just have to bear with it. Anyway, and so I arrived in the village, and you know, these women are really they're the matriarchs of their society, and everybody has a cell phone, but in many ways they live as their ancestors did a century ago. But critically, they are practitioners. They are very refined and highly trained artists, trained from when they're very young girls, and into being elderly women of the community in this art of split tone singing, the ohadi bow, the different instruments that are actually derivative from the Khoisan tribe, and then has extended out into the Xhosa culture and has been inherited through the different lineages. So you're already dealing with something very ancient and very true. And it's not relegated to the kind of periphery of society, that it's an interesting curiosity of people practicing something. It is central to life. And then I said to them, I just want to tell them a story. And, so I was working through a translator because the mothers don't speak English. They all speak in their native tongue, Xhosa. So Tolwana, who was part of the group, he translated every word for me, but it didn't just take 6 hours to tell the story because of translation. It was also because at every moment of every new turn in the narrative of the Aristaya, they stopped. They didn't even ask me to wait. They just immediately, there was a kind of pile-on of language happening. And then when I'd asked the interpreter to wanted to tell me what they were speaking about, from what I could glean, it was as if they were speaking about children in the community who were considering killing their mother, who had suffered the tragedies of the house of Atreus. And I just knew that I'd found, I had been very lucky to be in the midst of what felt like a deep rooting back to what it means to implicate a group of people, bring them into the performance space, not as artifice, but actually as a kind of main line into the community, into the way that they're speaking for us, on behalf of us. They're saying the things we don't necessarily dare to say. There's this reflection, and yet they're interacting with the characters. And I think this is what becomes so difficult as a director. They're interacting with the chorus, and yet the chorus is somehow observing the characters. But once I observed these women interacting with the story and with each other, it was the most natural, seamless thing in the world. So, there are many things I could share, but perhaps just the two things I would share about working with them, and I could speak just about that alone this afternoon. But one was there was an absolutely uncompromising level of pace. So, I would have I would ask the mamas to circle Electra and Orestes, just as a kind of choreography, where circles are very important within their culture, and it was just the most natural choreography that came to them and was perfect. But it was very slow. So at one point I said, "Oh, it's beautiful. Could you just go a little faster?" And they said, "Absolutely," and did it at exactly the same pace. And it sort of almost became comical. Each morning I'd ask for it a little faster, and then eventually I said, "Okay, let's take 3 steps instead of 5." So I had to kind of adjust. But the pace was uncompromising, and there was something in that reset the ethic in the room, because it wasn't about, ultimately as a director, you're the conductor in the storm, you're bringing many things together, but there was a fundamental understanding of what needed to happen, that as soon as I told these extraordinary women what to do in any way, their integrity would be compromised, and they would become it would be performative. But when I just left what was there was a great beauty and truth about it. And so I understood very quickly, they know more than you do about what needs to happen here. The other thing was that the Aristaya, as we know, ends tragically, in a way that implicates Orestes in this endless cycle of vengeance and violence, and costs him a great deal. And one of the mamas, Mama knows something, she came up to me the one day and she said, Tanam, meaning child, what is going to happen at the end? Are they really going to kill their mother? And I said, well, there's the script. And they said, no, that can't happen. So I said, yes, but that's the script, and it's been like that for thousands of years. And my whole impetus for creating this work was how South Africa had transcended this precipice of what seemed like an absolutely inevitable civil war, when the dispensation, the apartheid regime was disassembling, and so they said, oh no, we're not going to let that happen. So I said, okay, but that's what happens. So don't worry about it, and we'll get to that on the day. So what they said to me, when are we staging that scene? And I said, on Tuesday or whenever it was. And they said, okay, well, all right. So when we got to that scene, and as Orestes and Electra, as I had them running towards Clytemnestra, they just ran towards the children and grabbed Electra specifically, pulled this pickaxe out of her hand, and just held her. And she cried, and they prayed over her. And everybody in that room, in the rehearsal room, was deeply implicated as South Africans, before as humans, then as South Africans, then as artists. And I understood that the restructuring or the changing of the ending was what had happened in our country. The inevitability of vengeance was that the script should play out in the cycles of vengeance. But they once again showed me how, if I listened to the chorus of what I was really trying to manifest, something extraordinary could happen. So, my whole journey as a director has been about learning every time anew to listen, just to listen. And then, of course, you curate, you're the tuning fork, you bring things together in a way that becomes the curated public space for an audience. But that was a very beautiful and steep learning curve for me, in terms of if you let something unfold in the room, something remarkable already lives there.
And I certainly, as an audience member, learnt so much from seeing that, and I've got an unforgettable memory of meeting the mamas in the top tiny corridor of the Oxford Playhouse, which was such an extraordinary cultural collision. But as a theatre maker, that process of exploring the device of the chorus, or in that way with them, did that change your work going forward in terms of working with choruses, or in terms of ensembles, in terms of the way you approached that as a theatrical structure?
Yes, it did. You also learn very quickly that without that level of authenticity, you can't imitate it. So it was a great privilege to be in the room with them and to have their wisdom and their training as artists and their capacities. You can't get anybody else to create what they created, but it did set a barometer for me. It was like the litmus on what it means to be in the presence of a truthful chorus. And when I staged Lorraine Hansberry's Les Blancs at the National, Rufus actually said that he was going to keep my email for years ago, because I just made the strongest case, but we have to bring these women out. Only 4 of them, and they're a large group, but I just knew I had to have them present in this work as well, to bring that core integrity, to try and inculcate a sense of, to manifest a sense of the silent witnessing from the periphery. So when I'm lucky enough to work with the multicultural group, I do. When I can't, I keep them as a standard that I reach for, at any rate, for a sense of authenticity.
And that sense of witnessing or authenticity sort of ties together your work adapting classics with your work on testimony in the rehearsal room, and a lot of your work has looked at authentic testimony and how we stage that. I was really interested when you staged Kadmos, which draws on the Theban trilogy, that there was also extracts of text from is Mark Danner's work, internationally renowned journalist who was looking at foreign policy and torture. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of how that contemporary testimony was coming together with the ancient text?
Yeah, that was a particular time I was in New York. I'd been invited just when the project what's the word, that initial spark that happens. I had been invited amongst 9 other artists from around the world by Anna Devere Smith to come to NYU and to spend 10 days just talking about how our work in different ways is an agent for social change. And so, that we were all from different disciplines: cellist, a hip hop artist, I was the theater director, there was a choreographer, but we were all focused on theatre as social justice in a sense. And one of the artists there was involved in mural painting with the El Mosote community, who had endured Reagan's foreign policy of backing militia who engaged in these massacres. And so I was interested in looking at the House of Kadmos as an idea of a very powerful colonial power, or sorry, rather a superpower in the world, and how the secret that lay at the core of Oedipus's life, that there was something that was to be uncovered for us, for him to have an engagement with what he had implicated his entire community in. Because I was struck by the transition from an Oedipus Rex who is so dedicated to truth that he puts his own eyes out when he discovers the reality of this dark secret at the core of his life, and the inheritance to a Creon who's more towards the public spin, what the city will think, but also how to hold the city to accountability from a much more truth or post-truth perspective. So I was working with students at the National Theatre, and I was bringing together these different texts about these massacres that had happened. And one of the artists who was in that symposium, she was involved with the survivors of a community who had been massacred and would paint murals. And I'd had a dream that night just about Antigone, as one does. I dreamt about Antigone standing at the foot of this pit, because she'd been involved in the exhumation of the bodies in these massacres, this particular artist. And I was struck by this parallel of how Antigone's trying to bury her brother, but in so doing, one uncovers the truth about a community. So it was an involved process and just beautiful. I love working with students because there's just such a sense of courage and possibility, because there isn't that fearfulness that we develop when we've been knocked enough in the industry. And one of the practices at the core of my work is to just try and stay open and brave to trying new things. Anyway, so the students were very on board with that, and we had an extraordinary experience. It's a piece that I would like to still evolve and develop, but the core of how I'd like to explore the Oedipus story, the trilogy was the beginnings that were born there.
Well, I hope that continues to develop, because I think we'd all like to see where that might go. You talk about working with students and that openness before the knocks of the industry, and you once in an interview, I think it was with The Stage, said directing is asking people to run full speed into a wall with you, which I thought was a brilliant quote. But you've got some phenomenal performances out of actors, if that's the right way to phrase it, or enabled some extraordinary performances over decades. And could you tell us a little bit more about your process with working with actors? I know it's very collaborative, and I know that you are very, very open to collaboration in the rehearsal room, but in practical terms, what that might look like in a rehearsal process.
Yeah, I first of all, it's in the interview where I quoted that about running to the wall. In fact, I'd had a conversation with a wonderful producer, Patrick Gracie, and he had said that to me. And I said, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly. I'm very happy it was attributed to me in the interview. It was and remains a perfect expression of what I think it does take. You're inviting a company to, I suppose the metaphor I would use is you have a sense that this destination lies somewhere across the water, and you're asking people to get in a boat with you, to even build the boat in a sense, and to just keep rowing with the conviction that it is there. And the perils of getting lost, of or running towards the wall. It's the kind of conviction with which you have to just bear yourself. So I try and create a space in which it is safe enough that the actors can take risks. And what does safety mean? I mean, I think everybody's in a very deep reflection about that at the moment, about what safety means in a rehearsal space and in a creative context. But I don't think that safety is to shut down possibilities for conversation in case it creates difficult terrain. I think we're in the business of difficult terrain. I think I always say to actors, you're the ones that, there are people who make shoes in society. There are people who, attend to the human body or pull out teeth or, slaughter the cows. You're the ones that raise your hands and say, I will each night, strip back this protective layer called the personality, and I will allow the possibility of the story in all its dangers and darkness and beauty to colonize me, to inhabit me. And I've never lost the enormous admiration and deep respect for people who are willing to do that. But I'm also very, very aware of the kind of room that needs to be created for actors to feel like they can really be at their full velocity in that, and have that kind of guts that it takes to run at the wall or to get in the boat and just keep rowing, even if the destination is not clear through the mist. So, there are things like I ask people, not to speak about what we're creating in the room, because it creates, first of all, an external eye that the actor is watching themselves or commenting on each other's work. We want to be deeply, deeply in the body, and we want to be in the business of creating. We also don't want to talk the work away from the room. I have a very dear friend, Lara Foote, who runs the Backstay in Cape Town, and she's been a great friend for many years. And I once told her, I have this amazing story I want to write. And she said, don't tell me or you'll never write it. She said, you'll talk it away or you'll write it, but it won't be like the urgency you feel to tell me right now. So just do it. Shut up and do it. And so, this has been very important for me, that actors feel like they can just get in the room and try and make a mess and look foolish, and people won't speak about it over lunch, and or that night reflect on it away from the space. Of course, actors are extraordinarily reflective by nature. I think that's what draws people towards being observers of human nature and then trying to portray it. But I try to create a room that holds the sacredness of what we're trying to discover, and great rigor. I give everything and I want everything. so we try and create a room, and I'm in pursuit always of those artists who want that. It's just, there's no chemistry in trying to bring somebody to that point. So my auditioning process is also about trying to find that tribe of people. We've all got our tribe, and I'm always in pursuit of those people.
What's really interesting is that you make work so internationally. So you're making work in countries all over the world. So in some sense, building tribes in many places. And that sense of the relationship between the sort of rootedness in your own culture, and obviously your work's been influenced by growing up in South Africa, and the sort of internationalism of making work all over the world. How do you think that manifests in the work that you make?
I think it's that question, would I have made the kind of work or been the person I am had I grown up in, my parents were living in London for many years, and my sister was born there, and then by chance they decided to come back to South Africa, and so I'm a South African. So what are these questions of identity? I don't know. It's a great mystery, but it does shape us. I know that the social system that I grew up in, the apartheid system, shaped me profoundly. I know that stories that my father shared about the great silence that was left behind when his family left Lithuania and everybody disappeared in the Holocaust. There are things that weave a kind of fabric that then, they say artists circle the same stories. And it's my great love when I first read The Crucible, because John Proctor is called to the hour when he has to be he has to reveal who he is at that moment. And I realize that I'm always circling this moment. But I think ritual is very deep inside me. Johannesburg, although it's an urban metropolis, and I lived in the in the apartheid regime, and in my 20s, apartheid came to an end. But everything about living in South Africa was very brutal, very beautiful. You saw the best and the worst of people. Very sensuous, the kind of thunderstorms that happen in Johannesburg, the smell everywhere in the air all the time. So all of these, when sort of people come to see the work that I create and say, oh, she's burning incense again, I'm interested in the hierarchy of the senses, and how, I think to come to theatre is to come to our senses. And I don't mean, because again, we've reduced sense to common sense and to be logical. And I think we've been, post-industrial revolution, it was just all about productivity and how you commodify your skill, and we've been stripped down to this very intellectual process that infiltrated our theatres and how we watch it and how we create it. But I was very lucky to grow up in a country where acting was not from the neck up, and to be working with artists where the entire body was engaged, and where it really mattered when you had the stage say something, because certain stories were banned, and to not say something when you're growing up in the apartheid system. If you make a theatre that says nothing about it, that's a very political choice. There is no such thing as apolitical theatre. Every time you tell a story, you are placing front center a narrative that you would like for the audience to either continue to buy into or consider critically. So it's shaped me in every way. But each country I go to, it's a tribe that I think people already belong to. I try and identify them. We get in the room together, but I feel a little bit like, I'm driving my little bus and people get on and get off, but it's the same bus all the time. But we're always trying to broker new possibilities, new psychological contracts with audiences, new agreements with each other. So even now in Reykjavik, when I was working there, I just, to my great joy, found 30 actors in the room who had the same kind of hunger as I did for telling stories in the same way. And then I set up the parameters. I run a very tight ship in the room. I say, these are the parameters in which we're going to work. And within those parameters, go for it, give everything. And then it's up to me to make sure that, because what happens in the room will happen in the auditorium. If we don't broker that ground in the room, nothing is going to happen in the auditorium that we can have any authority over, meaning the transmission is created in the room. So anyway, I could talk and talk and talk. I'll let you ask another question.
Well, no, I was just thinking about when you talk about the act of of gathering and the sort of ritual of gathering and the tribe on the stage and the transmission of that to an audience. Obviously, we're talking really fundamentally about theatre as our place to gather as a community and talk about who we are or what we want to be. And for most of us, for the last year, that ritual of gathering has not been possible, and that ritual of gathering in general has not been possible, and specifically in theatres to tell stories has not been possible. And for you, what has that meant as an artist over the last year, and as an audience member? We've not been able to watch other people's work either.
I think quite a few things have happened over this year. I think that we, in the same way that the virus is transmissible through live performance, which is what made theatre so impossible and so dangerous, is exactly what makes it so beautiful and exciting. It's only transmissible live. We can do great recordings of things, but it's really the live transmission. And I think we've begun to understand how much that hunger exists inside us, that it's not a luxury, it's a kind of food. It's a kind of oxygen. It's a communing. It's a way that we come together. And having had that taken away from us, it just exposes really the essentiality of it. I think what it's also done is expose how fragile all our lives are as freelancers. And, I'd feel remiss not to mention this because I want you to say wonderful things, although it's been a very, very hard time for everyone. But, I know for me and for any freelance artist who depends on theatre, because people in film and television are still working. But the way in which we go at it, and we sort of put our heads down, it's almost monastic, and you just keep going at it for years. And because things came off track for a year, it's led people into very deep reflections about what it costs to make theatre at a very deep personal level. I know it has for me, and I've come out of that equation still feeling it's worth it. But it's exposed the fault lines, and I think the value. And of course, this feels sort of sentimental and indulgent to try and explain to communities in crisis and governments, but I grew up in a community, in a society that, there's a great poet and writer, Antjie Krog, in South Africa. She says, "We tell stories not to die of life." That I know that had I not had that space to go to as a 15-year-old, where I went to the Market Theatre and I was watching plays that would very quickly get banned, but it felt like the small island of truth, where somebody was telling me the truth, or that in some way I could come to terms with what was happening around me. I think at our peril, we leave that as a luxury for society. And I think if we look at societies where that has been over-regimented or over-censored or killed as a form, it shows in the society. There's a kind of something about, it's like lungs, blood that carries oxygen. Maybe blood is a better metaphor.
There's a grim irony in a crisis when you most need that space, and it's the one thing that you can't have. But as theatres reopen, perhaps tentatively, they're due to be reopening today in the UK, very tentatively with reduced capacities. But are there, having taken that space, are there things you'd like to see change as we build back? There's also an opportunity, isn't there, to think as everything rebuilds, whether there's, as an industry, there are things we might want to change going forward.
Yeah, I think that the way freelance artists are expected to live in this very, very precarious way. Of course, it's always been, well, if you love it, you'll do it, and if you don't, you won't. But the reality is that you can just keep refining and working and you can go for years still living on very, very meager means, but you're so enriched by what you're doing that you don't take a moment to look up and notice. And this moment has given us that. And I think this is the moment where we need to gather as communities around the world, the theatre tribe, and actually begin to restructure the way we expect freelance artists to maintain themselves. You know, I think that when it falls apart, it tends to fall apart for us as individuals. Somebody gets ill, but because it's happened en masse as a community, I don't know what those answers are yet. What this crisis has left me with is the questions, but it's really crystallized the questions for me. And I'm very interested in getting into some conversations now. I mean, of course, the dream is I wish I could, you know, create some kind of a space where I could create an ethic and a way of going forward. But the truth is we're all in our little foxholes, all of us, just trying to keep our small space alive and nourished. But I think when we come out of survival, we need to regroup and think about how we really can start to change the way we organize ourselves.
I'm excited to see what happens going forward as we come out. I'm going to just take a moment to remind people to, if you'd like to ask a question, please do post it in the chat or email it. And in a moment, I'm going to open up to those audience questions. I'm just going to give Claire a moment to start transferring them across. But before I do, I think for many people who are fans of your work, I would count myself among that, one of the most extraordinary productions and unexpected productions was your Miss Julie, your adaptation of Miss Julie, which engaged so bravely with the horrific headlines of, you know, gang rape story. And I wanted to ask you, that's an absolute example of taking a classic play and making it speak to the most urgent and difficult news story or cultural truth, I suppose, of our time. And in what order that manifested? Did you know that you were going to use that play to tell that story? Were those things synchronous? Was it a topic you wanted to tackle and you were looking for the story? You know, how did that sort of almost I know it was very surprising, I think, to many audiences when they first encountered the way that the play could answer to that moment or that news story, I suppose, but how that came about.
So there's Miss Julie, which is the adaptation of the Strindberg, and then there's Nirvaya, which dealt with the gang rape. So I just wanted to know which play.
Sorry, Nirvaya.
Nirvaya.
Yeah,
so,
sorry.
Not at all. So with Nirvaya, that was, I just got a call from a friend, a Facebook friend in India, and she just said, you know, this terrible thing has happened. I posted something on Facebook, and she just saying, my mother, my daughter, myself, the morning the news broke about this horrific gang rape that had happened in Delhi. And when she immediately messaged me and just said, look, we need you here. You need to come over. The streets are erupting with protests. And so, and I thought that was very important to be invited. I don't think it would have been my place to arrive in India. You know, one always has to be very careful of arriving in a society and creating testimonial work in a way that comments on a society when you're not necessarily from that society. But you know, testimonial work for me is really about, again, about listening. And we managed to create a piece that was really breaking open the silence that surrounds sexual violence. And this was a couple of years before the Me Too movement. So it was a critical moment. When we opened in Edinburgh, I think it's one of the most powerful moments that I felt privileged to be in theatre and to be present in that room where you know, we thought it might move people to some degree, but there was a kind of eruption amongst the audience, and we held many post-show moments after that opening. And every time I was in the room, present with people who witnessed the work, we would have these moments where people would raise their hands and break their own silence, because so much of the shame around sexual violence is somehow located with the survivor and not with the perpetrator. And this is protected by silence. It still implies that there's something to be ashamed of. And so the work was very much about keeping the flame of this young woman's very brutal attack and tragic death alive as a kind of righteous rage. So that was Nirvaya. Miss Julie was an adaptation of the Strindberg, and this was where I wanted to bring to the fore the issue of land ownership in South Africa, and the way people have been cheated of their inheritance within the apartheid system. So, and that's a great love for me, is to take a classic and to try and bring a new angle to it and have people. All I knew is that the Strindberg was shocking enough to have been banned for the first year in the playwright's own country, and I was just like, okay, it's sort of kind of interesting now, sort of a bit twee and sweet. It's like, you know, the driver and there's nothing shocking about it. I mean, it's a gorgeous play still, but there's nothing shocking about that. So I just wanted to kind of get to the root of what was so extraordinary about this event, that two people could have sex and then have the conversation that the society most has tried to avoid. Anyway, so that was Miss Judy.
Thank you so much, and sorry for asking that so clumsily while trying to
Right.
read audience questions. Sorry, trying to do too many things on Zoom at once.
By the way.
So I'm going to pass on some of these questions here. I've got one from Sylvia. Says, you've made work all over the world. Is there somewhere that you'd like to work that you haven't yet had the opportunity to do so?
Oh, yes, I'd love to do a new version of the Die Boek, which is an old Yiddish play. And I would love to go back to, well, I'd love to go to Lithuania and do that. That's where my family is from. I'd love to do that. I would love to create work. I want to go back to South Africa and create more work. I'm really drawn to countries where there is, I can answer the question best like this. When I was a younger director, I used to ask what stories I needed to tell. And now I look at it as what stories need me. And that's really what leads me to the places that I want to go. But yeah, there are many. I'd love to explore Chekhov in Russia, of course. You know, there are other African countries I'd love to create in. So that it would take me a long time to sort of identify all the different places I'd love to be, but it's stories that need telling. I want to go there.
And sort of following on from that, there's a question from Oliver here, which is sort of slightly inspired by Ariane Mnouchkin's practice, I think. If you could, would you build up a place and a team where you could develop your productions in that way that Mnouchkin has outside Paris? In an ideal world, would you lay down a route, or is the traveling part of the work?
It would be a dream. Unfortunately, I come from a country where there just was never that kind of funding, and France is very good in that way, that they identify the people who they're going to invest in. I can say that having a daughter and being a traveling director has been one of the most extraordinarily challenging things, and I'm still negotiating it, and I'll be negotiating it until she leaves home. But the idea of actually rooting down somewhere, but in the way that Peter Brook or Mnouchkin have done, where there's a kind of internationalism, that's very interesting to me. I don't have an interest in becoming peer in a particular society. I've got that sort of traveler soul in me that I always want to be visiting. But I think with something like what Minushkin has managed to create for herself with great support, or what Peter Brook managed to do, yes, there is the possibility to just keep opening up new possibilities. When I watch Ivo van Hove's work, I can see the great benefits of coming back to the same practitioners. Every time I start a production, I'm really starting from square one, and I'm trying to create a culture within the room, tell the story, and I've got 5 weeks to do it in. And the idea that I could grow my capacities with a group that already has a language with me is the most exciting thing I can think of. So if that would ever become a possibility, I would, it's more than would I, it would be a kind of ideal situation.
I'd love to see that happen. There's a very specific question here about Molora. The moment from SOS, and the question is, the moment when the mummers hold Electra, somewhere between restraining and cradling her, was an extraordinary visceral experience as a spectator and an education in itself. Was there an alternative script or trajectory for Molora before the mummers caught Electra in rehearsal? And when you say you saw the Oristara speaking to South Africa's journey, did you have an original or alternative version of that relationship in your script before they took over?
I was prepared to go with the script as it was written, and that, Orestes has to then, move into this extraordinary system of justice and the Furies, and, this reckoning with what it means to be caught in the cycles of vengeance. I thought that that's what this examination would be. It's like what happened in the room was what I'd hoped for the work, and yet I hadn't found the answer to doing it, because the gumption to just change the ending. I had to have my hand forced, as the mummers did, where they just said to me, we're not letting them do that. We're just not letting the children do that. But creativity is an incredibly delicate, unfathomable thing, finally, because I gather images with sort of flow diagrams. I have reams and reams of paper that I capture just these kind of floating thoughts on that will come to me, even something that comes to me in another production, and I realize, oh, it actually belongs to another production coming up in the future. But as a South African, witnessing some of the footage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were these women who would sit in the community halls or the seating and just listen with their Kleenex kind of tucked in their sleeve and crying at times and listening. And they were like they held the space. And I only realized afterwards, all this sort of the pieces fall into place, that perhaps I had gone and sought these women in the village because I knew that they were going to lead the way for me, as they had done for the country. Now I'm kind of creating this monolithic force of Black women in South Africa. Of course, this community, these individuals made that possible for me. But I know that very female matriarchal energy in the country. I created a work years ago called A Woman in Waiting, which was in fact the first work that Tish Francis brought out to the Oxford Playhouse, and thus began my great love and friendship for Tish and for the Oxford Playhouse, because the Oxford Playhouse for many years under Tish's leadership was really the closest thing I've had to an artistic home in a kind of cohesive way, which is why I really wanted to do this evening, because I just feel like it's a community that is close to my heart because of that. But A Woman in Waiting was really about the capacity women have to wait in South Africa. That's what I witnessed. I witnessed it in all the homes where there's a woman working and she's waiting to see her child once a year, or at the end of the week when she finally gets to go home, waiting for these absurd pieces of administrative bureaucracy that make life possible, on so many levels. And so I realized already that the ideas, the honeycomb was building for years prior. And this is how these creativity comes together, I think.
Yes, and just talking about Tish and the Octa Playhouse as home. I know there are lots of people who'd be watching today for whom the Oxford Playhouse is their local theatre and has done such extraordinary work, really, in relation to the university and in terms of bringing international artists into Oxford, and that sort of ability that Tish had to create safe spaces and communities and to literally move stuff to make happen. I remember literally the auditorium being rebuilt for Molora, and that sort of absolute commitment to going, we will make this happen and get this work to these audiences is sort of, and it needs people like that to sort of to be absolutely determined to bring something to their community, to go, this is work that needs to be brought here and seen here. And I sort of in awe of that idea of being able to caring so passionately about your audience and wanting them to see certain work, and therefore literally moving your entire theatre around in order to make that possible.
And I'll just add on to that Tish and I were reminiscing. We caught up today for the first time in some years, and we were reminiscing about the different actors who ended up staying at Tish's house long after the productions were over. The way Tish took care of me, the way there is something about producing theatre when you implicate yourself in the way. I mean, there's a South African concept called Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. And I never felt like I was dealing with somebody who was producing theatre, even though that's precisely what was happening. She was the artistic director and she was making things happen. But there was such a deeply human engagement with all of us and with the work that it felt like home. It felt like South Africa in many ways. And I think all of us responded to that very human way that Tish has, and the way the team around us folded in around us. Also, it was very formative, very important in my development as an artist, and in also just feeling like somebody invested in the art and the humans, including myself.
Which is all about making the space that we were talking about right at the start, in which it's possible for people to be brave and take risks. And
that's right. Tish, in a way, did for me, and the Oxford Playhouse, what I was trying to do for the actors. It was like, here you are. These, this is what you need. Take the risks. We'll rebuild the auditorium. We believe it. We believe in it. Go ahead and do your fullest work and engage in the risk. And
then the opportunity for people to see that work who wouldn't have otherwise. I would count myself as a young theatre maker in people who had that extraordinary opportunity. I've got two questions that I think I ought to ask you before we finish that are coming from the audience. The first is from Henry. He says, Nirvaya was extraordinarily powerful and one of the most viscerally moving experiences I've ever had in the theatre. However, I've been left wondering ever since whether what I watched was theatre or something else. And for you, what makes material like Nirvaya theatre as opposed to reportage, and is there a difference?
Great question. Testimonial theatre is a very complex genre. And I think one has to be incredibly humble, very have great conviction, but move in with great humility as you're making it. So all the women who performed in Nirvaya were survivors of sexual violence, and each story that was told was their personal testimony. And so it's a very, very complex relationship with written word. Each woman told me their stories. I then scripted, found words, because I think metaphors and the beauty of language makes us able to swallow the hard pull of the brutality of the stories. So it was a complex psychological contract with the audience, because no matter how much we said in the intro that these are our stories, it's still, people sometimes thought they were actors until Sneha, who is an incredible woman who survived being burnt by her, her husband at the time attempted to murder her by burning her alive, and had her son stolen from her. And it was only when she would stand up, and she's very scarred, people would start, and some people had it already, they understood the premise of the work, but at that moment, I think people would start to understand, oh, these people are really on the line. And it's a delicate one. It's a delicate one, and again, that you're refining all the time. And of course, when you engage in long touring, there was a point where the company I knew and they knew that to keep going back into the wound of these memories, there's a point to which it's healing. It can be, although I always say that can never be the premise of the work, or you end up with very grandiose ideas of who you are as a storyteller. And ultimately, we're trying to tell a story that can shift the needle, perhaps. But when that pain and trauma becomes something that you as a director and as the actors are asking themselves to revisit to a point that it becomes corrosive, it has to be left to sleep. But the asker of the question, it's a very astute question, because it is a complex experience to watch that work. It's complex to understand, am I watching performance or reality? Well, I think it sits right at the precipice of what theatre is, which is, I will share with you my truth. Even if I am doing it through playing a role like Miss Julie, but I will share my deepest truth through the device of this, whether it's my story or a way in which I can tell fragments of myself, and to invite the audience into that authenticity. So it was what we call testimonial theatre. It's different to verbatim theatre. It's different to documentary theatre. Testimonial theatre is a very particular genre, and it's the one that ethically I felt I could engage in above and beyond the other genres of this kind of work.
That's an absolutely brilliant answer. Thank you. And I think as genres, they're all developing, I think, at the moment, and it'll be interesting, I think, coming out of a year of no theatre to see the work that comes through testimonial theatre or verbatim theatre in response to this crisis. Naomi has asked, or she said, this is absolutely fascinating, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you think about translation as a concept and a process in your work. In Molora, there's a character called Translator with the chorus, and you flag your use of multiple translations throughout for a mix of languages, but you also leave crucial moments not translated in any obvious way with very powerful effects. And I'd love to hear a bit more about your approach in this respect.
I think it's very important that we understand when we're watching theatre, how language has been such a deeply colonizing act, that languages have been stolen, have been subjugated, have been made to be understood to be inferior. So when an actor is speaking in their second or third language, as is often the case when you are watching Black artists in South Africa, artists who are telling their deepest truths in a language that is accessible to be inclusive for all of us. This is an act of extraordinary generosity. And I think the moments where we are not given precisely what it means, I know as a white South African, the times when you can't, because we weren't taught the vernacular languages in school. Now the kids are, but we were not as white school children. When you're left outside of that conversation, you're not being left outside, that people are simply talking, but you understand that there is an entire world and an entire experience. Language is such a complex, incredibly delicate thing, that in some languages there aren't words that can fit the experiences. And so these moments where we don't get the translation, I think are very important moments when we are watching people who are sharing stories, particularly when their trauma is directly related to colonialism and to oppression, and particularly by oppressors who have taken degraded the position of language in that society. And so when I did A Woman in Waiting with Tembi and Charlie, we knew that the opening words had to be in isiZulu, and she had to speak them, and we had to wait for several moments before we heard any English coming out of her mouth. And interestingly, I just found that I actually stumbled on that purely technically as a director, because I would work with actors and then say it in your mother tongue first. And then I would see how the body would transform and the relationship of the words and the language would transform. And then I would also see how that would affect me as an audience member. So language is a very loaded thing. All kinds of power structures exist inside language. And when we purposefully alienate an audience, to the degree that, I mean, this is the actor ways of directing, is don't let them come unhooked, but to just hold out on an audience in certain areas, so that they don't take for granted that every word they're hearing after that in their language is an act of generosity on the part of the actor, to take us inside an experience that in many ways cannot be represented in its trauma, in its richness, in its beauty, in its power, in its dignity, except through this device of translation. So there are many, many layers. When you ask the Minushkin question, just that question alone, I'd love to spend time unwrapping with artists. But as a director, you're on the clock always. You get in that room, you've got 5 weeks to stand something up, and the clock is ticking and you go. But these deeper explorations belong to that question, or this question belongs to that. These explorations that still need to be done.
Well, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to just sort of scrape the surface of the much deeper questions underneath. And I know everyone will go away with a head full of thoughts and questions and bigger layers to unpick about classical drama, about testimonial theatre, about translation. And you've done an incredible job of both answering questions with such articulateness and opening up so many questions, I think, for everybody watching today. I'm incredibly grateful, and I'm very sad that we couldn't actually welcome you to Oxford tonight for an evening of drinks at the Playhouse, which would have been a gorgeous homecoming. But I'm very glad that the power of Zoom has allowed us to be able to not only chat today, but to share that with a really wide audience. It's much appreciated. So I'd like to say a massive thank you on behalf of the APGRD, on behalf of Oxford Playhouse, on behalf of the Cameron Mackintosh Fund as well, for chatting to us today and for answering all of our questions so generously.